Hey, we're back for part two of the respiratory system. I hope you enjoyed part one. We will go ahead and get started into part two, where we're really going to discuss more of the physiology behind the respiratory system and some of the disease processes. So as always, please, whoa, I am so sorry, like and subscribe if you haven't already, and we will get started. So first off, one more thing I want to discuss with you, just so you can get some context into one of the disorders or diseases that we have that the respiratory has issues with, is the notion of surfactant. Okay, surfactant is a substance that is a mixture of lipoproteins, so fatty proteins, basically. These are this is secreted in the alveolus by specialized cells. And what surfactant does is it reduces the surface tension or the attraction of water molecules between one another. So um, it's almost like when you drop dish detergent into, say, water that has grease in it, right? Or even water that doesn't have grease. It's just easier when it's got grease because you can see it better. But the surface tension of the water is broken by that dish detergent when you drop it in, just a drop, right? Because what it does is it disrupts the attraction of the water molecules to one another, which is what creates surface tension to begin with. Okay. So surfactant does that for us in the lungs. Now, without surfactant, what would happen is when we would go to exhale, the alveoli or the alveolus, singular, um, if you recall, they look like little clusters of grapes, sort of. What would happen is upon exhalation, the alveoli would kind of like stick together because those water molecules would attract to one another. There'd be nothing to break that apart. And so it'd be really difficult to reinflate those when you go to take the next inhalation. So that's very, very important, especially with babies, because you hear a lot of times where they say, oh, the baby was premature and the baby was so premature that the lungs were not developed and therefore the baby couldn't survive. It's not so much the development of the lungs that's the problem as it is the existence of the surfactant. So I just kind of wanted to get that out there since we're going to be talking about the physiology here, and some of the diseases. Okay, so gas exchange. We had mentioned initially that one of the prime functions, probably the prime function of respiration is gas exchange. Okay, so in looking at this little diagram here, it kind of is just, it's a simplistic diagram, but it makes the point. Okay, if you recall in video one, in part one of the video, in the alveoli, the alveolus itself is surrounded by or encapsulated, so to speak, in capillaries. Okay. And remember, capillaries are certain types of blood cells that are the one kind of blood cell that allows for substances to cross in and out of them. Okay. Um, so what happens is the deoxygenated blood, or the blood that doesn't have a whole lot of oxygen left in it, um, and therefore primarily has carbon dioxide because it used up its oxygen and now carbon dioxide is left over as a waste product, comes down into those capillaries. And this is representing the alveoli. Okay. That deoxygenated blood comes down once it, oh, I'm so sorry. Once it is in contact with the alveoli, and that those gases are able to cross those barriers. What happens is the deoxygenated blood allows the CO2 or the carbon dioxide to cross over into the alveoli. At the same time, oxygen, which we have breathed in, is crossing over into the blood, into the capillary, okay, reoxygenating the blood. And that carbon dioxide that's now inside of the terminal end of the lung, basically, is able to be expelled or exhaled, okay? So you're basically bringing in oxygen, goes all the way down to those alveoli. That oxygen crosses over into the blood stream. At the same time, the carbon dioxide that's being carried by that bloodstream crosses back over into the alveoli, going into the lungs, and breathe out the carbon dioxide. Okay. But it happens this quick. All of that just happened in like literally half a second. Okay. So that is how that occurs. That's what gas exchange is at the alveolar level, okay, within the lung. So deoxygenated blood, rich with CO2, drops that off into the alveolus. The alveolus that just brought oxygen in pushes that oxygen into the bloodstream to reoxygenate the blood so that it can carry it off. And where does this primarily go? It goes back to the heart. Because if you recall, and if you have watched my cardiovascular videos, and if you haven't, shame on you. No, if you haven't, please watch them. It'll make more sense. But the cardiovascular videos talk about how there are pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins that push blood into the lungs to drop off carbon dioxide and pick up oxygen. This is where it's happening. Right here is where all that is happening. And so then this beautifully nice oxygenated blood is going to go back to the heart where it can now be pumped throughout the body. Now, what is that then called? That is systemic gas transport and exchange. Okay. And here is how that works. Okay. So you have the airways, you have the alveoli. Everything that just happened, or I just described happening, happens. Then the oxygen enters the blood at that capillary interface with the alveolus. Oxygen then gets transported in blood, dissolved into plasma or bound to hemoglobin inside of red blood cells. Okay. It goes into the heart, gets pumped out, goes through the body. The oxygen then diffuses into the cells that need oxygen. And cellular respiration decides how to metabolize CO2. CO2 then diffuses out of those cells because remember, CO2 is a waste product. So the oxygen came in to the cells gobbled it up, used it, and went, oh, and then diffused or caused CO2 to come out of the cell back into the system. That CO2 then gets transported bound to hemoglobin. It goes back to the heart, and the process starts all over again because now that deoxygenated blood that's carrying carbon dioxide gets pumped into the lungs. And what happens? That goes into the alveoli. We breathe it out. The O2 comes in and boom, boom, boom. It happens all over again. And this just keeps happening every time we breathe, every time our heart beats. Okay. That is systemic gas transport and exchange. Okay, so let's go through it one more time. Breathe in, oxygen, yay, goes into the capillaries at the alveoli, gets transported into the heart. The heart pumps it out through the body. The oxygen diffuses into the cells that need it. Cellular respiration occurs. It metabolizes out the CO2. The CO2 as a waste product now diffuses out of the cells, gets transported back to the heart, into the lungs, cross the CO or across the alveolar membrane. We breathe it out. Breathe in oxygen. It starts all over again. Okay, so that is the systemic circulation and the pulmonary circulation. Okay. All right, let's talk about disorders. Okay, because of course, it would be wonderful and beautiful if gas transport and gas exchange and everything happened just perfectly in the diagrams, the blue and the red, and all of that happened every time. Unfortunately, it does not. Okay, so we do have some disorders. I'm sure you have all heard of COPD, which stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Now, COPD, a lot of people misinterpret it as being a disease in and of itself. It's actually kind of an umbrella of many diseases, that's over many diseases. Bronchitis being one of them, emphysema being another one of them, and asthma being one of them. Okay, those are all COPD illnesses. Bronchitis is basically just an inflammation, because itis means inflammation, right, of the bronchi. So from video one, part one, the bronchi, which are the branches, the tree-like branches that go out into the lungs, those become inflamed and it makes it a little harder to breathe. Now you can have acute bronchitis because of infection that's usually bacterial but can be viral. Or you can, and that you know, you get a little bit of treatment, it goes away, you feel better. That's what acute means. Sudden onset, usually sudden departure. Chronic bronchitis, on the other hand, is something that is ongoing, chronic, right? And it's where the patient's bronchioles are inflamed to one degree or another almost always. Okay, so they're always going to have issues. Emphysema is a condition that usually develops over time. Many of the people who develop emphysema, it is due to cigarette smoking. And what happens with emphysema is you actually have rupture of the alveoli. And what that creates then is excess mucus. And it really, really makes it difficult to get a good breath in or out. Many people with emphysema do not last for very long with it. Some do, but generally they have to be put on oxygen in order to help them breathe. Asthma is basically just a reduction in airflow because of inflammation in the lungs. Asthma is usually a childhood condition, and many children that have asthma will actually outgrow it, or at least it will diminish over time. There are those people though that have asthma for a lifetime. I've seen many a patient that was older with asthma. And some people will even, if they have it as a young child and you know, quote unquote, grow out of it, will have it kind of occur from time to time into adulthood, in the form of sometimes exercise-induced asthma, where if they over exert themselves, they will have more of an asthma attack, so to speak, which asthmatics, when they have the attacks, it makes it very difficult to breathe. And again, there's a wide range of, you know, severity for people who have asthma, very mild to very severe. Most asthmatics will carry a meter dose inhaler with them, an MDI. in order to use that as what they call a rescue inhaler. So when they do have these moments or attacks, they can actually use that. It contains a medication that actually opens the bronchial passages up and helps them to breathe better. And that medication is called a bronchodilator. Go figure. Um, Influenza is an infectious disease. Um, we get strains of that every year. I think we are starting to come out of flu season. Flu season usually starts around October, ends around April or May. It depends on who you talk to. But that is an infectious disease, so that comes and goes, although it is very dangerous for those who are at risk for respiratory illness, the very, very young, the very, very old, the immunocompromised. So you have to be very careful with influenza. Pneumonia is caused by inflammation of the alveoli, and pneumonia can either be caused by a bacteria or a virus. There are both kinds of pneumonia. Pleurisy is inflammation of the pleura. And because of where the pleura is, again, going back to part one of the video, it can exert pressure onto the lungs if that inflames because it's surrounding the lungs. So if you have inflammation of that area, it's going to push pressure onto the lungs. It's going to make it very hard to get full expansion of the lungs when you breathe in. And then tuberculosis or TB is a bacterial infection of the lungs and is very contagious. We do have more TB in the US than one would think. However, TB is very prevalent in less developed countries oftentimes, and there's many countries that actually immunize against tuberculosis. The US does not, however, but there are many countries around the globe that do. So what I always, from a clinical standpoint, if you are going to test a patient for tuberculosis, you always want to make sure that you know whether they've been vaccinated against it or not. Because if they have been, then because of the nature of a vaccine, which is basically just a dumbed down version of the illness, they are more than likely going to come back positive for TB, even though they do not have it, but because their body has created antibodies against it due to the vaccine. So in that case, many places don't do skin tests anymore. Some do, a lot do, but the gold standard has become the quantiferon test, which is a blood test. And for quantiferon, as long as you indicate that the person has had the BCG, which is the vaccine, then they can actually, upon testing, separate that out and actually look to see if they have true TB or not, if they're positive for it. The only other way to test for somebody who's been immunized or has had previous exposure or a positive TB test is to do a chest x-ray. So just kind of a clinical note there. Lung cancer, of course, is probably one of the more common types of cancer, more prevalent in women than men, at least in the US. There's various types of lung cancer. Some can be treated, some cannot. And generally, there's risk factors involved. Smoking, being around for long periods of time, environmental irritants, asbestos, coal miners, breathe in a lot of particles. Anytime you've breathed in chemicals, really anything that can hurt the lungs can be a risk factor for cancer. And it's not fun. It's a horrible cancer. It's a horrible cancer. No cancer is good, but lung cancer is especially devastating. Pulmonary edema Edema, of course, is just an accumulation of fluid. So when it's pulmonary edema, it's an accumulation of fluid in the lungs. This oftentimes is part of congestive heart failure. People that have congestive heart failure will oftentimes experience pulmonary edema, and fluid in the lungs really makes it difficult to breathe. Pulmonary embolism is a blood clot in the lung. This can break off from other areas of the body and make its way to the lung, obviously, because if you have a blood clot in another part of your body in a vessel, eventually, because of the circulatory system, it will possibly make its way to the lung, and pulmonary embolisms are often fatal. So definitely want to be aware of risk factors for that. And usually it's if people have had previous like DVTs and things like that, any other types of blood clots. Now, we started this off with talking about surfactant, and here's kind of why I wanted to put that out there so you knew what it was. Infant respiratory distress syndrome, or IRDS, is seen primarily in premature newborns. And this is where there is an insufficient surfactant production present. And this can, of course, lead to the collapse of the alveoli, and therefore you can't move air at that point. So that is especially heartbreaking if that happens, and especially dangerous for the itty bitties. So those are just a few of the respiratory disorders. There are more, possibly a little more not necessarily common, but I just wanted to get a few of those out there for you. And that is all I have for you today. I hope that helped a lot. As always, if you ever have questions, please drop them in the comments. Otherwise, you can also comment on anything else you would like for me to make videos on. And as always, if you haven't liked and subscribed already, please do. And I will see you next time. Have a great day.